okay, I'm going back to where we were now. And I felt that I didn't do the criticism of naturalism very well. I'm certainly not going to go back over it and read the quotes I was reading, which I felt as I read them didn't actually nail the point I wanted to make anyway. I think I can make the important point simply. And about naturalism, remember, is the general criticism that you can't understand Dasein in terms of what you can get about what you can discover about nature by way of natural science. He thinks that's impossible. Go back to page 94 where he says that in very cryptic terms, and then go on from there. So on 94, he says, 3 lines down, near the bottom of 65 in the German, this manner of knowing them, that knowing them as present at hand, as nature, has the character of depriving the world of its worldhood in a definite way. That means desituating, de-worlding, get it out of any relation to us and our practices and purposes. Then you get the kind of nature that science deals with. And then and the claim is, next sentence, nature as the categorical aggregate of those structures of being which a definite entity encountered within the world may possess. That means nature as the sort of way of being that all the stuff from electrons to galaxies have, namely there being present-at-hand substances with present-at-hand properties. Those, whatever properties you have, and whatever substance you have, you can never make worldhood intelligible. The thesis is that to get to that kind of ready presence at hand, you have to leave out all the holistic, meaningful, situatedness that goes with worldhood, and once you leave it out, I'm not sure why he thinks, and that's when I was worried last time, I don't really know why he says it's impossible to get it back. I think it's extremely implausible to think you can get it back. But it would be nice to know what the impossibility argument is. I can make up half of it. That is, this came up in a discussion after class last time. Suppose science just declares that they're not interested in the phenomena, that is our experience of meaning, our experience of worldhood, our consciousness of all of the phenomena. They will just explain the meaningless movements of the meaningless particles that make up reality. And they'll explain us as objects. And they'll just finesse what in the earlier days were called the secondary qualities. They'll just finesse all the stuff that we've been talking about. Now, Heidegger, I think, has an argument that that's impossible. Science can't just ignore the phenomena and count them as mere experiences. And he's got that in the idea is that you can't get to the present at hand. You have no access to the present at hand. You can't make sense of the present at hand except on the background of worldhood and our practices for having intentionality and making sense of anything. So you can't just say that's just appearances, we don't have to account for it. Science has to account for it if they're going to get an understanding of where their understanding comes from. And he says at one point, but I couldn't find it, but you keep your eye open for it, we get to the present at hand through the ready to hand. And I think that means for him, we can only make the present at hand intelligible as what you get when you leave out the situatedness, the world, and all that goes with the ready to hand. But you need the whole ready to hand worldhood to account for how we can study anything, including science. There's a footnote in the margin of 94 that might have something to do with this, where he says that nature can never make worldhood intelligible. He writes in the margin, rather the reverse, exclamation mark. That's what I've just been saying. That is, the only way that you can make nature intelligible is by way of worldhood. And that's in a sentence. He's trying to stress that in the marginal remarks. I don't know whether, did I tell you this already, that there are marginal remarks. They're not all that fascinating, and when they are, I'll bring them in. But he spent every once in a while, and he doesn't have any dates, he wrote in his copy of Being in Time that he had in his ski hut in the mountains where he went to think, and he would write marginal comments, and now they are translated in the Jones-Stanbaugh translation as footnotes. I don't recommend you buy the Stanbaugh translation because I think the one that you're reading is better. But I will put it on, did I say this already? I should put it on reserve so that if you want to go look at the footnotes, you can. And I'll do that. I'll put my copy of the Stanbaugh on reserve. And now on 122, why do I want to say we should look at that as a punchline? Yeah, that's the punchline now. This, in case you aren't convinced by what I've been saying so far about the way science depends on the phenomena that Heidegger is describing in order for us to be able to do it at all. Remember, over and over, that doesn't mean the entities that science deals with depends on our practices and so forth. It's a very tricky point, which I keep coming back to, and we will get back to when we get to the reality chapter. The intelligibility, the understanding of being that enables us to encounter and study electrons depends on us. But electrons go right on even if we would never existed and have their weight and charge and everything Heidegger thinks, I'm sure. But most people don't believe this, so whenever I come across a place, I read it. Here's a place so let me read something about 10 lines down on 122. It's about 88 in the German, and bottom of it. He says, and only if entities within the world can be encountered at all is it possible in the field of such entities to make accessible what is just present at hand and no more. See, it's about accessibility. It's not about there were any electrons. I mean, you make accessible electrons as just present at hand and no more, but you have to get there with it. That only becomes accessible in the field of meaning and so forth. By reason of being, now comes another important thing, by reason of being just present at hand and no more, these latter entities can have their properties defined mathematically in functional concepts. And ontologically, such concepts are possible only in relation to entities whose being has the character of pure substantiality. All that's about beings like electrons. In galaxies, you get access to them, and then and then you find these pure substances. But I'm just going back and repeating, you cannot explain in terms of those pure substances the experience of meaning and worldhood and openness to objects and so forth that made you able to get access to these pure present at hand things in the first place. Okay, that's the best I can do about that. I'm going on to the next round. For the next move is, okay, so naturalism fails. Well, Descartes was never a naturalist anyway. He didn't think you could explain human consciousness and meaning and so forth in terms of the present at hand. He didn't think you could explain it in terms, explain it. Well, no, he didn't. He didn't think you could explain it in terms of the present at hand. He needed another substance and to explain how we can have a world of meaningful objects. And that was the res cogitans, the thinking substance. That's Cartesian dualism. It's still around. I mean, in a certain much more refined and modern and up-to-date way, it's still it was certainly in Husserl, I'll show you, who's Heidegger's teacher, and it's still in Searle. There has to be both minds and stuff, and minds give meaning to the brute stuff. That goes through all of this. Now, I'm going to just, on the way there, touch base with something I didn't read last time, which I should have read, then which I was just presupposing on page 125. Heidegger starts his account of Descartes and Descartes' attempt to understand the world by defining substance. I've been saying this over and over, but it's time to see it in print. So it's at the beginning of section 20, on page 125, in the third sentence, German, top of 92. He's translating Descartes' Latin, and he says, by substance we can understand nothing else than an entity which is in such a way that it needs no other entity in order to be. And Heidegger's underlining is and be because he's saying this is an ontological claim. This is Descartes' ontology. This has been the ontology of everybody since Aristotle, that the ultimate sort of building blocks of reality are substances. That's what that finally really is whatever there is that is self-sufficient, and that what there really is, now that's the general ontology. Then you have to look and see, well, what kinds of beings are self-sufficient? And it turns out, namely, res extensa, the bits of matter that are moving around, that now strings or quarks, those are bits, whatever they are self-sufficient. Descartes thought they were bits of just extended matter. They were sort of atoms for Descartes. The atoms moving around have substance as their way of being, and now we have to add, and minds are also self-sufficient and have substance as their way of being. From Descartes right through to Searle, minds are so self-sufficient that you could have stuff going on in minds where there was even no world at all, sort of the Matrix picture, where all of reality is really a kind of big, complicated, interconnected illusion, and what there is finally, and in there it's sort of brains, but it's also minds. Never mind those details. What we want to, brains don't come into it when you do it from Descartes' angle or Husserl's. There's something called minds, and they have their own, it has its own status, namely consciousness, and it has its own capacity, namely intentionality, or transcendence in the old sense, not Heidegger's sense, namely pointing outside of itself to objects. But it can point outside of itself to objects, minds can, even if there aren't any objects. Then everything it's pointing is wrong, and it's all in a kind of illusion, like the people in the Matrix. But the mind is self-sufficient. It can go around doing its pointing to things, whether there are any things or not. I mean, think of Santa Claus. I mean, whether there's any Santa Claus or not, you can have a representation of it in your mind, and you can have intentionality about it in the sense that you believe that there's a Santa Claus, and you can even, if you're lucky, see Santa Claus coming down the chimney, but there isn't any Santa Claus. Doesn't matter. Okay. Now we've got brute facts in Searle language. That's that's extended things. And we've got what in Searle language, intrinsic intentionality. That's the mind's capacity to give meaning to things. And how does it work in Descartes already? And in Searle it hasn't changed a bit. Well, that the minds give meanings, value predicates, in Searle language function predicates, to bits of matter, and thereby treat matter as lecterns and chairs and chalk and so forth. And that's the crucial move for getting worlds out of substances, of these two substances. And now it's so important to just see that. And particularly since, amazingly enough, in Searle's book on social reality, it still sounds exactly like this. I'm going to read you the bottom of 131, in German, the bottom of 98. I'm going to read a long passage, but it's just straightforward what I've been saying. Descartes has still laid the basis for characterizing ontologically that entity within the world upon which, in its very being, every other entity is founded, namely material nature. This would be the fundamental stratum upon which all the other strata of actuality within the world are built up. The extended thing, as such, would serve in the first instance as the ground for those definite characters which show themselves, to be sure, as qualities, that which at bottom are quantitative modifications of the modes of the extensio. That's the extended, that's the brute facts. These qualities, now these brute facts seem to have qualities. That's the interesting problem. These that means that there are somehow qualities, not just quantity modifications. And now we have to figure how that can be. These qualities, which are themselves reducible somehow to quantities, would provide the footing for such specific qualities as beautiful, ugly, in keeping, not in keeping, useful, and useless. The useful is the main thing, because that means hammers, chairs that are working or that are broken. All of that is something the mind can attribute to things. Now, there's something that bothered me as I went by that has surprised me. The stuff that shows itself as qualities, which is at bottom quantitative modifications of the modes of extensio itself. Why is that? I mean, in Searle and in Husserl, and I would have thought in Descartes, the qualities are brought in by the mind substance. Why would they be modifications of the extensio itself? Maybe that's,
Things were provided by the mind. He seems to think that color is part of the objects themselves, and so he tries to explain color as something.
Ah, I didn't know that. Okay, well, that must be what this sentence is about. Okay. So it's funny, though, that it can sort of misleading, because color isn't on his list of beautiful, ugly, useful, and so forth, and that really confuses me. But at least this much is true, and Adam and I and Heidegger are all agreeing on this. Some of the value qualities of things can't be gotten by putting together the extended stuff, no matter how cleverly. You can't get out of that the beautiful, the useful, and so forth. That's the dualism. That's that you have to bring in something different from this other kind of substance. I think that's right, isn't it? I mean, otherwise you'd have a monism. Okay, so now let me go at the top of 32. If one is oriented primarily by thinghood, these latter qualities must be taken as non-quantifiable value predicates. Aha, he answers my complaint in the next sentence. You were going to say that? Somebody's nodding. So these value predicates aren't ultimately quantifiable, by which what is, in the first instance, just a material thing, gets stamped as something good. Now, don't read as good, meaning good sort of in the sense of valuable or something. You read good for something. So good for sitting, or good for putting your books on when you're lecturing. These are function predicates mostly, you needn't think of anything except function predicates. And when in Searle's, what's the name of the social reality book? The Construction of Social Reality. He concentrates on the function predicates. I'm going on. With this stratification, we come to those entities we've characterized ontologically as equipment ready to hand. You saw me just talk about the lecture and the chairs. The Cartesian analysis of the world, where world means the totality of things, would thus enable, remember the quotes, when world is in quotes, it isn't Heidegger world, it's the wrong view of world that people have had up to Heidegger. The Cartesian analysis of the, quotes, world would thus enable us for the first time to build up securely the structure of what is proximally ready to hand. All it takes is to round out the thing of nature until it becomes a full-fledged thing of use, and this is easily done. Now, does anybody, I hope you're with it enough to be stunned by that sentence. What's going on there? Why is he seemingly contradicting himself? And it's not a trick question. It's just saying you got to pay attention. Does Heidegger think it can be easily done? Not at all. He's being ironic. That's the view that the scientists or John Searle has, and Husserl. But it's not his view. And why it's sort of surprising is Heidegger's capacity for irony is pretty minimal. I don't remember any place else in Being and Time where he ever says anything that he doesn't think is just plain true. But here he lets himself really go crazy and assert the opposite of what he really believes. And there's a place where he says, and that is sort of funny, that in the margin, I wrote it down, just a second. Well, let me go to it in the natural order. Now, how many, not very many, had Husserl last summer, or may have Husserl probably next summer? We're trying to at least have Husserl in the background for people who want to know Heidegger's teacher and what Heidegger is totally against all that. Anyway, Husserl does say, in his book Cartesian Meditations, happily so named, and this is just Husserl version of the same thing we just read. He says, an existent mere physical thing, such as a hammer. What has he been reading? In fact, he read Being and Time twice, but he didn't get it. He said, oh, this is just psychology and anthropology and sociology. It's not transcendental philosophy. Well, it's neither, of course. It's existential phenomenology. But Husserl doesn't have a category for things. So an existent mere physical thing, such as a hammer, is given in the synthesis of passive experience. Never mind, that's Husserl jargon. It's given to, quote, spiritual activities, which begin with active grasping. Spiritual is a funny translation. I'm sure it's geistige in German, and you could equally well say mental activities. And that would make more sense. There's nothing very spiritual about grasping, taking something to be a hammer. But it's perfectly fine that it's mental acts that enable you to take it as a hammer. And then in Stanbaugh, on page 91, there's a footnote to this, and a wonderful footnote for me, because I've always said this. All this is intended as a critique of Husserl, he writes in the margin. Because Husserl is sort of out of Being in Time. He's, as I said, I think once before, people wonder if they used to criticize me because I kept saying, well, this is all a critique of Husserl and Husserl's view of intentionality, and everybody says, well, no, it isn't even mentioned in there. And there's this dedication to Husserl for which Heidegger says he owes everything. Well, the reason he's not mentioning Husserl, I think, is because he's writing for eternity, and rightly so. He's going to be the main philosopher remembered of the 20th century, when Husserl is long forgotten, as far as I can see, just as a last-ditch Cartesian, and he isn't going to get entangled with even, it's like not mentioning the presidential candidate for the other party. I mean, why should you give Husserl any publicity? But in the margin, he does say that, of course, it's all aimed at Husserl, and it's aimed at Husserl because the students have been listening to Husserl. So in his lectures, in Basic Problems and in History of Concept of Time, it's all over, written all over that he's talking about Husserl, and that he's got a different, more primordial understanding of intentionality than Husserl. And here he's also aiming at Husserl. And so now Heidegger has to answer the people who say we can understand the world as brute nature and then just contribute as minds meaning and functionality, function predicates. And that means those people are mainly Descartes, Husserl, Sartre, who's very close to Husserl, and Searle. I'm sure there are millions of others too, but those are the big ones that I know anyway. And now what is his answer? And I've said this once, but now we're going to have to spell it out. His answer is that when you understand how holistic a function like hammering is, and that means how hammers only make sense in relation to nails, in relation to wood, in relation to frames, in relation to houses, and then the end of that for the sake of chain is, and people needing shelters. But remember, from my point of view, that's still the beaver chain, so to speak. But then you also have this further holism. This is what I was talking about last time. And it only makes sense for beings who take a stand on themselves as shelterers or something else. And that is so holistic that to think that you can just take a blob on the end of a piece of wood and add an isolated predicate that it's for hammering, that you would capture anything like what it is to be a hammer, would just be absurd. I mean, once you see the phenomenon of what it is, what's involved in something being a hammer, you couldn't, the idea, remember, value predicates are substance-like. They are self-sufficient function meanings which you pin onto a self-sufficient nature entity, and that's supposed to capture enough meaning of hammering that you can that we normally have. Well, Heidegger would just say no. They all presuppose the referential whole and significance. So on 132, at the bottom, in italics, in the German, I don't know where we got lost. Their German has disappeared from that page. The very bottom of 99, 10 lines from the bottom of 132. And if we are to reconstruct this thing of use, which supposedly comes to us in the first instance with its skin off, that is, that's the brute fact, does not this always require that we previously take a positive look at the phenomenon whose whole, that's better than totality, whose wholeness, whose holism, such a reconstruction is meant to restore? Meaning, once you get the phenomenology right, you see that the whole Cartesian project is wrong, impossible. Now comes, for the rest of the lecture, something that's only going to happen once in here, and that is a bit of the history of this, because it's so interesting that this is the point at which Heidegger became extremely relevant to people actually having a research program, which was in effect the attempt to do just this job of capturing everyday intelligibility using brute facts and function predicates. And that was, by this amazing accident, happening at MIT when I was teaching at MIT. So for a little while, Heidegger and reality, namely money from DARPA, the Defense Department, of about $1 million a year, comes to MIT, and they're promising that they're going to be able to create artificial intelligence, that is, they're going to be able to use computers, and all they're going to have are brute facts and function predicates, and out of that they're going to make it this robot that's going to behave intelligently. And there I was teaching at MIT, and reading Heidegger and believing his phenomenology and saying, that's impossible. You guys can't do that. And so there was this fascinating moment in which what would look like the most abstract talk about being in this, by this German philosopher in this dense way, had immediate relevance to a very popular and well-supported research program. And I'm going to talk about it now and give you quotes about it. And every once in a while I turn out to be in these quotes. I'm not trying to make propaganda for me, but Heidegger and me got very entangled at that point, and they didn't think of themselves as fighting Heidegger. They thought of themselves as fighting me. They tried to keep me from getting tenure at MIT. It's too late to get Heidegger. But they said that they had to get rid of me at MIT because I was giving a false appearance of plausibility and scientificness to this kind of crazy philosophy stuff, and that was very dangerous because somebody might read this at DARPA, that's the defense money people, and take away their millions of dollars. At which point I was tempted to find somebody to dress up like somebody from DARPA and have lunch with them in the faculty club and scare the people from the artificial intelligence project to death. Things were very tense. I mean, none of them would speak to me and could be seen speaking to me without getting into trouble, except one courageous one named Joe Weizenbaum, who was beginning to have doubts about AI, and he would meet me out at his home in Lexington. It was all completely bizarre. but I won. I got tenure, and they failed. It was amazing. They had a research program which was exactly applied Cartesianism, and that research program had been refuted by Heidegger, and they just didn't know it. But they found out it's over, that research program. Minsky was the head of MIT at that point, and my big opponent. And lately in Wired magazine, Minsky has said that artificial intelligence has been brain dead since the 70s when it encountered the problem of common sense knowledge. That has encountered the referential totality and collapsed. But it took them, say, 20 years or so to realize that they're never going to solve the problem of common sense knowledge. Now I want to tell you more about that. Because, as I say, this is the one time when you get to see this amazing fact that Heidegger is there in the background, seeing all of these people doing all these crazy things, knowing that you can't do it that way. So the next person to consider is Douglas Lenat, L-E-N-A-T. He's only famous for being wrong, but he was wrong in a kind of courageous and interesting way, because what he saw was that you can't just put the function predicate hammer or to hammer onto this blob and expect to capture common sense knowledge or human intelligence or make an artificial intelligence. It's much messier than that. And so Lenat said in 1985 that he was going to start a research project which was to capture all of common sense knowledge in very complicated computer structures, and they weren't going to be just predicates. They were going to be whole bunches of interconnected predicates all referring to each other in all kinds of complicated ways. He called it psych. I don't remember why. I guess maybe because at one point when he started, he said that he was going to try to capture all of the knowledge that's in the Encyclopedia Britannica. At that point I said, who cares about that? What's important is the knowledge that's not in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the common sense, everyday coping knowledge that's taken for granted by everybody who reads and writes the Encyclopedia Britannica. And then Lenat got it. And it became a kind of funny thing when he gave talks, because he would sort of demonstrate the weird stuff that he has to put into his body of knowledge that isn't in the Encyclopedia Britannica. I remember one was that when, I don't know, whoever was president, somebody, when, say, Nixon was in Washington, his left foot was also in Washington. That's one of the facts you have to put in there. Or another funny, it was kind of, the audience was in stitches, because it's a kind of special humor to see the funny things that we take for granted. He had this story understanding program, and at one point he was trying to get it to understand that people could fall and drown. And so George fell into the river, gravity pulled him down, and he drowned. And the computer came out with the conclusion, and gravity drowned too. And you just can't, it gives you a sort of crazy feeling when you start realizing all the assumptions that we don't have to make because we have the familiarity with the world, that this program that he's making has to be making explicit. And so he believes that you've got to not just have definitions, but have what he calls frames. And a frame is, for instance, all that we know about hammers. That there are this many kinds of hammers, and that they weigh this much, and that this is how they break down, and this is how much they cost, and this is the kind of people who can use them, and these are the kind of people who can't use them. Everything we know about hammers has got to go in there. And so he thinks he's going to need millions of frames with thousands of facts in each. That's why I think he's courageous, though mad. At least Minsky said, in print, said, well, when we get 2 million facts, then we'll be able to just have intelligent machines. And Lenat knew that wasn't the case, but Lenat was way off. He said, we'll do that within 10 years. It's now been 20 years. since 85, more, isn't it? 85, 95, no, roughly 20 years. Lynat is still going on, still putting in facts, having what he calls these cyclists, which are the sort of slaves who continually put in new information about hammers or whatever, and it's been 20 years and he isn't getting any closer. Husserl was making the same mistake, but he was a little more self-conscious about it. At some point, Husserl said that sort of spelling out the world, and Husserl thought we had a mental representation of the world. So we ought to be able to describe the system of beliefs which we have in our mind, whether there's any world or not. And then he discovered that was, quote, an infinite task. So he was discovering the same thing that Lynat was discovering, that it's this holism that Heidegger's talking about is something they can't get. But when I was involved in this, I sort of switched the question from how many facts you have to put in to a further problem, which I think Heidegger sees, that the more facts you put in, the harder it's going to be to get the relevant facts to come to bear on any particular sort of utterance about hammers or seeing a hammer. All these facts are supposed to come into the picture when they are relevant. But the trouble is, it's hard to get the relevant ones, and now you've got millions of facts about hammers. How, when you're trying to understand somebody's particular relation to hammers and doing something or asking something or buying a hammer, which of those million facts are you going to get in? Well, Lynat said that must be that's a problem of relevance, all right. So we better have some relevance maxims. And that's going to tell us how to determine which ones are relevant. I skipped something. Do we need that? Let me think. Yeah, we need it. But I'll jump ahead. Let's do the relevance maxims now that I mentioned them. They don't work because what they are, he had many of them. And the typical ones are, you can imagine, well, if it's something near in time to this, then this fact is likely to be relevant to that fact, and there's things are not likely to be relevant across a great deal of time. Easy to think of counterexamples to that. If you make a promise now to do something a year later, it's very relevant, even though it's not nearly as near as what's happening the same day. And of course, all kinds of things in history where people have made promise-like things. Anyway, you can imagine that. Or another, I was just thinking, he said, well, if it's in the same domain, it'll be relevant, and if not, not. And I made up the story, well, suppose the domain is plants, and now, but you've got this case where there's a jockey about to ride a horse but the bettor discovers that the jockey has hay fever and the field is full of goldenrod, so it's very relevant to know about the goldenrod, but it doesn't seem to fit into the horses and betting domain at all, which is just meant to show that anything could be relevant to anything, and your relevance axioms are never going to help. One way to see they're never going to help is, I had lunch once with Gua, who was, I forget his first name, who was Lynat's main assistant, and asked him, well, what happened with these relevance axioms? He doesn't talk about them anymore. And Gua said, well, he got thousands and thousands of them, and then he didn't know which relevant maxims were relevant. And I thought that was a nice way. I mean, Heidegger would have liked that as a way that this could break down. And Fodor, whom I mention Jerry Fodor every once in a while now. Jerry Fodor, I mean, some of you will know him, but lots of you won't. He's a very, very good, famous philosopher, cognitive psychologist, who was also at MIT in those days. Only he believed in some kind of cognitivist program, but he also was always sort of much more open to the problem that was lurking, the way Husserl was, than people like Lynat. Fodor says, in a book called The Modularity of Mind, but it doesn't matter where it comes out, he says the problem is, and this is the problem we've been talking about now, the whole holism of our system of beliefs about everything. The problem is to get the structure of an entire belief system to bear on individual occasions of belief fixation. That is, that's what believing that it's time to get a different hammer, for instance. Whatever. Some specific belief about something specific. Remember I said, well, Al, there are millions of facts. How do you get the relevant ones? Well, he says, we have, to put it bluntly, no computational formalism that shows us how to do this. That is, to see how the entire belief system bears on individual occasions. And we have no idea how such formalisms might be developed. This is the last sentence of his book. If someone, a Dreyfus, for example, were to ask us why we should even suppose that the digital computer is a plausible mechanism for the simulation of global cognitive processes, the answering silence would be deafening. And later, in reaction to Pinker, that some of you may know is the sort of guru of cognitivism now, Fodor wrote a book about 4 years ago called The Mind Doesn't Work Like That. And the last sentence there is, what our cognitive science has done so far is mostly throw some light on how much dark there is. So far, what our cognitive science has found out about the mind is mostly that we don't know how it works. Well, Fodor is smart. Fodor understands that there's a big problem. He has no idea what to do about it, and that's sensible too if you're committed to having to find some model in which you have these formal relations, that is, logical relations between elementary facts. But he's always seeing that, gee, we don't know how to do this. We don't even know how to begin to do this. So now, where are we? I haven't let anybody say anything since I started talking 45 minutes ago. It's shocking. Doesn't anybody want to say anything? Sort of, I'm telling you a story that you have really no reason to have any opinion about. You have to take my word for it, unless you want to call in Minsky or somebody or Jerry Fodor. So I'm going on with my story. So now we've got one more thing I have to tell you, that there is something called the frame problem. That's not the problem of how to get everything into the hammer frame, where every object has a frame. It's a special problem, and it's a problem that everybody sort of knew was going to be unanswerable by the people in artificial intelligence, the sort of Cartesian approach, but they just sort of repressed it. And then when I heard this frame problem, I thought, oh boy, there it is. That's what's going to get them. So what is the frame problem? Well, the computer has in it, like we have in our minds, according to this view, a representation of the current state of the world as a bunch of interrelated facts. And now suppose something changes in the world. Like, I don't know, I paint a wall blue in a room. How does the computer determine which of the represented facts stay the same and which representations have to be updated? It's another version of the relevance problem. When something changes, it's just incredible. I fold up my book and I put it over here. How many beliefs in my representation of this room can I leave the same, and how many do I have to change? There is no systematic way of dealing with it. And Minsky said, well, you've got to have a different kind of frame to deal with that. You've got to have frames that deal with typical situations, like going to a birthday party. And then you can organize that will tell you what are the relevant facts at a birthday party, that you have to pay attention to the kids who are there, to the presents, to the ice cream and cake, to the parents. You don't have to pay attention to whether there are any goldfish in the house or whether it's sunny or not, and so forth. And interestingly enough, and this is just something else that's sort of amazing in all this, Minsky came up with this idea of frames. I've never been able to prove what I'm about to say, except it's a fact. I had a student named Jim Geiser when I taught at MIT, who I taught Husserl to. Husserl, when he was dealing with this problem, came up with the idea of what he called frames, in which in the frame for anything, there were the necessary conditions, the essential conditions of the thing, and then a lot of, were default conditions. And lo and behold, Minsky comes up with the same idea, only not for objects, but for situations. So the birthday party frame has in it all the essential features of birthdays, and then it has sort of the optional features of birthdays, like maybe whether there's a clown or not. And Minsky called it all frames. So lo and behold, Husserl is in there defending his side through Minsky against Heidegger, who's in there defending his side through me, and it seems to be a sort of head-on collision. But it turns out that you never could get the necessary you could somehow no matter how many frames you made, you couldn't really deal with the frame problem. That's why, remember he says that's why the AI has really been brain dead since the 70s. The frame problem and common sense knowledge are the same problem. It's common sense knowledge, what's changed and what hasn't changed when I've moved my book from here to here, and how to fix it. And just one second, let me see, because I want to get this unit together. So there's no way to deal with the frame problem that Minsky could figure out, or anybody could figure out, and Fodor thinks nobody will ever figure out. Yeah, now go ahead. Yes. Yes. Good. That's right. So let me say that. If artificial intelligence means making computers that behave intelligently somehow, that's certainly not what I'm arguing against. The research program that what I'm arguing against, which was the only game in town when I was at MIT, is now, you'd have to say, symbolic information processing, or as I say, my old student John Hoagland calls GOFI, good old-fashioned AI. That's a particular way of trying to make a computer intelligent, and it's a particular model of how we do it, namely by having representations of the world in our minds in which all these facts are laid out, and rules for finding the relevant one, and rules for saying what changes when you change something, and that's the one that they had to give up on. Now, just to show you what else you could do, and it's in fact what they're doing, you could try to model the way the neurons do it, and then you'd have simulated neural networks, and then you could try to teach simulated neural networks how to discriminate various classes of things by giving them descriptions of things, and then they come up with it. Here's a successful one. There's a neural net that can distinguish the sound coming off rocks, the ping, the sound that comes off rocks with sonar, and the ping sound that comes off mines. So if you're going around looking for mines, you want to be able to do that. And there are human beings who can do that, but there are simulated neural nets that can be trained to do it, and can do it as well or better than people, but they don't have any rules in them, or any basic facts in them, or any representations in them. You just change all the weights on the neurons until it gets the right answer, and I'm not going to tell you more about it, but it's in relation to him. So you know the guy in Brown who does this, by any chance? Anderson, I think it's. Yeah, because they're one of the famous neural net people who, during all the time that the Husserl, Descartes people were thinking, was going on making simulated neural nets, and there's promise in that. And in fact, there's a funny way in which that turns out to be Heideggerian. We're about to get to that. There is a right way to think about this, and lo and behold, not only does Heidegger have the argument that good old-fashioned AI, symbolic information processing, based on mental representations or computer representations in them of the world, that's not going to work. But then there is something else that might work. So let's go back to that. Now let's see, where are we? Okay, yeah, Lynat's and Gua said, did I tell you this? That Lynat lost touch with reality about 8 years into this program, which, and it is, I think, amazing that he, in spite of the sort of evidently getting nowhereness of it, he goes on and on. But he's written up something which is very relevant to us, which is an insight into why he thinks that it will work if you just keep trying hard enough, and why, if he had taken this course, he would not have made this big mistake. So let's, if he read his Heidegger. So here's what happens. Lynat says, well, this is a big job, all right, to try to, in effect, construct all of the world using only the quotes world, namely the facts about things and the beliefs about things and the brute facts about things. Why does he think that he can do it? Well, he thinks the following, and it's funny, he says this in AI magazine. Well, how should we do it? We should find out how people do it and program that. I mean, and now you have to translate that. That means, how do we, out of brute facts, make up a world in which the meaning relations and the relevant relations are captured in your computer model? And his answer is, well, since we experience brute facts and give all that meaning so that there's a world, all we have to do is figure out how people do that and program it. And that's his ultimate sort of optimism. Now, I'm going to stop and let somebody say something. Why is that sort of almost a joke? But it's a very sort of pedagogically interesting joke. So, problem, let me repeat. How do we manage to deal with all the huge number of brute facts in the world and give them all a meaning? Answer, well, I don't know, but humans obviously do it, so all we have to do is find out how humans do it. Where's the problem? Why is that interestingly wrong? You want to say something? You look like, yeah.
You don't do it that way. You don't think it's
Exactly. Exactly. We don't. I mean, that's the Cartesian assumption, and Searle assumption, that there are only brute facts in minds, and so minds have to assign function predicates to the brute facts. But that's wrong. That's bad phenomenology. There isn't any way humans do it. This question, how do we manage to represent and organize the vast array of facts that makes up common sense knowledge and find just those that are relevant in the current situation? That is, how do we give meaning to brute facts? And the answer is, we don't. And what do we do then? Well, now we're connecting up with the course. What does Heidegger think we do? Well, the tricky thing is that if you look at the situation from outside in a detached theoretical way, there are only brute facts, and then you have to figure out how to give them meaning. But we are, to talk like Heidegger, always already in a situation. Familiarity is constitutive of our experience. We never, except on, weird special cases, have this problem of how to give some meaning. Well, if you come across some strange thing that you don't know how it is, when you're doing sort of Egyptian archaeology, then you would have a brute fact and you would try to figure out what its meaning was. You would probably fail because you won't have the totality on which it fits, but at least you might have that question. But generally, of course it's not mysterious. You grow up gradually, crawling around, you discover what floors are for, and finally you discover what doors are for, and you discover how to open the doors, and once you have enough experience, and your neural net, whatever is going on in here, gets tuned somehow, which obviously is going to have an explanation, but it needn't have an explanation in terms of facts and representations. But once you get once you have enough experience, then what? When it's hot in the room, windows just draw you to open them. When you want to get out of the room, doors just draw you to go out. And the whole world is always already organized in terms of familiarity. Now, one more thing, but of course not the finished familiarity that you and I have more or less already, knowing lots and lots and lots. We're knowing it isn't even right. Now, seeing the world in such a way that what's relevant just pops out for us. If it's hot, it's windows. If it's leaving, it's doors. We don't have that sort of full blown. We gradually get it, and now, yeah, but it looks like maybe I'm begging the question, how do we gradually get it? The answer is, I have no idea. I mean, the brain does it somehow. Whatever it does it somehow using the neurons and the connections on the neurons. So maybe if we could make a model of that, we could make a something maybe on the scale of a lizard that did. There's a famous professor here, Walter Freeman, who thinks he can program something that will behave like a lizard, but he doesn't do it the way, with internal representations. So I'm not focusing enough for you. So we gradually, somehow, there's a process, and it doesn't involve, as far as anybody knows, rules or representations and beliefs and frames and such. Something goes on, and we get a familiarity with the world. And once you've got a familiarity with the world, then the things that are relevant just pop out at you. Now, but Lynette begs the question, of course, when he says, well, humans give meaning to brute facts, so all we have to do is figure out how they give their meaning, so to speak, fact by fact to the brute facts, and we will then be able to do it. Well, that won't work, because that's not what we do. Now, I saw a hand of somebody. Yes?
Well, the study of consciousness, a lot of times, very people study neurological disorders like this step on. But any neurological disorder that resulting on the familiarity with the world breaking down, or something to shed light on that.
Yes, sort of. There are models of how us and animals, and we're not any different than animals on this, gradually make sense of the world so that it shows up for us full of meaning, and we need a new bit of jargon, and that's where Heidegger comes back in. The idea is not that we come to the world like minds from outside and gradually learn about things and learn about breakdown. This always already thing when you do it in a neuro way, is called coupling. And the idea is that somehow the brain and the world are always already coupled, so that there isn't any sort of mind coming in from outside. And in Walter Freeman, that means that, this is just going to be jargon to you, but just so I can say something, he has models of rabbits smelling. That's what he's studied all his career. And when rabbits learn a new smell, and rabbits, when they get a smell, then the olfactory bulb in their brain goes into a certain attractor. That's just a certain energy state. And when they learn a new distinction, say between the smell of celery and the smell of turpentine, then they get another attractor. And all these attractors get rearranged. There's this holism of attractors and distinctions and so forth. Anyway, the crucial thing that you have to get a feel for is that the attractors are only there when the rabbit is there acting in the world. There's this coupling between what the thing that has a smell and the state that the brain is going into. So, and it's that always already. You can't understand what's going on in the brain except that it's interacting with the carrots or whatever, and the animal is, and you can't understand interacting with the carrots except in terms of all the other things the animal has learned to interact with. That's considered Heideggerian AI. In fact, in Freeman's case, he considers it Merleau-Pontian AI, because Merleau-Ponty is much interested in what we share with animals in having something like a environment anyway where we can distinguish things. And so the Heideggerian level Nobody's trying to program how beings take a stand on their own being. But if we could just get a clue as to the familiarity, I mean, animals have familiarity too. You don't need to have a familiarity in which things connect up with your self-interpretation. It's enough remember, they're two for the sake ofs. Animals, beavers share the for the sake ofs of building huts, and they need shelter, and that's the kind of thing that Merleau-Ponty is interested in, and that's the kind of thing somebody like Walter would try to understand how the brain does it. Nobody, and that makes us interesting and mysterious, can even imagine how the brain is going to make this all connect up with somebody taking a stand on their identity. But in a certain sense, of course, unless you are kind of mystical, you think the brain does it. What else could do it, is my feeling. I mean, you might think that the soul does it, and if you do, that's fine. But the point is simply, just what I'm saying now, and I'm going to stop saying it, is that there are people with other models, and they think they're Heideggerian because they think that the organism is coupled with the world from the start. It's always already in it. And then, as Wittgenstein puts it, light dawns gradually over the whole. You get a more and more refined holism, whether you're a rabbit or us. Yeah. Yes, how is that going to be relevant? She wants to talk about Oliver Sacks, who wrote a book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and writes for the New Yorker about all kinds of weird brain pathology. I like him a lot.
First, for everybody,
Yes, the story about the glove. Right. Good. Yes, it's amazing. It sounds so Husserlian and so wrong-headed. I mean, this guy got such a brain damage that he's almost become a phenomenologist as opposed to a Heideggerian phenomenologist. He's almost become a Husserlian phenomenologist. When shown a glove, he doesn't see it as something to put on your hand in colder weather or anything. He says, I see it's an object with 5 outpouchings. It's a glove. He deduces from its sort of properties its function, and in a non-world-like way. And this poor guy is so far gone that somehow, I forget how, he manages to misdeduce his wife and think that she's a hat. And he tries to put his wife on as they're leaving the office. And that's pretty extreme. But in any case, yes, there are pathologies in which people lose being in the world. That's a very funny, and funny isn't the right word, weird thing, and Sachs is interested in it. Did I see another hand? Okay, oh yeah. Yeah.
Totally liquid bags.
Say the things louder. I had trouble hearing you. And I'll repeat it. That's right. Heidegger rejects the idea that, of course, in weird special occasions, again, you get a brute fact and have to deal with it, like archaeologists. But generally, we're always already in a world in which the background is not brute facts. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it loop backs as part of totality and appropriate order.
But the brute facts aren't part of the referential totality. They're what's left when the referential totality either breaks down, as when something's missing in the workshop, and then there's all this stuff around that you can't make any use of. Of course, you still know what it's for, but it's sort of half broken down. But normally, we never encounter brute facts. And even, of course, the archaeologist isn't really encountering brute facts. He knows that this is some kind of equipment which relates to other equipment and so forth. So we are always, the crucial thing is we're always already in a world in which lots of stuff is interconnected with lots of other stuff. And we don't even have to be conscious of it. That's what you were saying too. We just automatically cope with it so that the relevant things just show up for us. So am I answering you, or just missing what you're saying?
Their order of priority keeps doing it.
That's right. It is an order of priority that people like Husserl and Searle think you start with brute facts. That's what, remember the joke, the ironic joke in Heidegger says, you start with brute facts, then you add meaning and function predicates, and that's easy, why not? That's sort of the Lamarck picture. But that's not how, but the phenomenology suggests, and that's again, I keep wanting to repeat, the crucial thing is that you're always already in a meaningful whole. From the moment you're born, it just isn't very structured yet. And you're never standing outside it. Well, that's not right. And we are, maybe this is something you want to say, we're capable of taking a theoretical attitude in which you do just stand outside and look at brute facts. That's the research program. That leads to the research program of good old-fashioned AI. But that is, one, it's a derivative something we do. If it really is extreme, it's pathological, like the man who mistakes his wife for a hat. And in any case, if you do it, you can't use the pieces that you've got when you take this theoretical attitude and step out of the situation to recreate the situation. That's the claim, that you can't build up the holism out of these elements. Even though you can get, even if you could get to the elements, the minimal, meaningless bits, they wouldn't do you any good because you couldn't put them together and, for instance, relevance would be missing. Yeah.
Part for philosophers like Searle, it's important to have the part where you assign meaning to things to get us from hunter-gatherers into jungle to civilization today, and try to explain the development of how if we're able to assign meaning to new brute facts. Does Heidegger have a story of getting us from there?
No, Heidegger doesn't have a story about how, for instance, the institutions that make, say, money possible, which is an example that he uses a lot, but he does think, and how many have seen Searle's, money example? Here's a piece of paper dyed in various ways, piece of cellulose, and what makes it money? Well, it takes the fact that there are institutions and practices that treat this piece of cellulose as money. That is, they give it that function. And that's okay. But but if you try to make a whole, and as a philosophical position, you could have it. But and in Searle, it's all on a background, and that makes it much more close to Heidegger than, say, in Husserl or Lennat. But the problem is, or the question is, how do we see this? Do we see this as a piece of paper to which we then attribute it being money? And I want to say, Searle and I've had this debate, no, we see it as looking valuable, unlike the way big bills before there were euros in bright colors they don't, we see it already. Kids are always already in the world, and by the time they see any money at all, it doesn't look like cellulose with colored spots on it. It looks valuable. And I don't know if Searle needs to disagree, because he's going to give a logical analysis of what's going on, not a phenomenology, he says.
Or Searle, and I don't mean putting Searle in that group, but you're just involved in different projects where you're just describing the experience and he's trying to explain.
Right. I mean, if you want to explain how these complicated institutions develop and what how intentionality is involved in them, that's right, that's Searle's project. But if you're going to do the ontology, then Searle's a Cartesian, because if you ask, well, what is there finally? The answer is brute facts and minds with intentionality. And he's going to analyze everything in mind to world direction to fit, and world to mind direction to fit, and that's a different project. Okay, you want to say something? Good. Yeah. whether we could ever experience it. Well, I think that's right and not quite right. I mean, it may be that once we're always already in the world, we can never totally de-world, so that we can get. No, we can take a theoretical attitude, I think, and get brute facts. You can get cloud chamber paths or something, and they only mean something in a theory. This is for later. Because, I mean, this is about to do whether science gets brute facts, and when they do, what do they do with them? Well, they use them to find out about brute objects, like electrons. And I think Heidegger thinks that's all terrific, but that's derivative from remember, we're back at the very beginning of the lecture. It's only because we have a world, and we can deal with it ready to hand, that we can finally, by a lot of de-worlding, get to the brute facts. But they are, or maybe never. But yeah.
It seems for Heidegger that the new meaning can only be generated out of minorities.
I think that's right. Well, I
then becomes meaningful. You talk about a sort of quasi-meaning that gets clarified.
It all depends, and we have to put it off until we get to the reality chapter, on what does it mean to de-world, which theory can do. And if theory can de-world, it looks like you can cause a kind of systematic breakdown that will reveal the brute facts to you, I think. But we have to look and see. We may disagree about that. I want to make sure that I get the next 5 minutes to finish this, because we're not going to go back to it. So let's see. I want to see if we've done all these quotes. Yeah, there's the Husserl quote. There's the Fodor quote. No, there's still one, the punchline. We've got to get to Heideggerian AI. And that is, I'm rushing to Heideggerian AI. There is a book out this year called, it looks like this, Reconstructing the Cognitive World by Michael Wheeler. And I will put my copy on reserve in a library, unless I can get the library to get it in a hurry. What's interesting about this book is it says where AI is now is Heideggerian AI. And that's his thesis in this book. And where's my little quotes? Because, yeah, here we are at the bottom. No. I guess I didn't. Oh, this is annoying. I didn't put that quote in, but I'll put it in right now. Where are we? 5, 6. A Heideggerian, quoting him, a Heideggerian cognitive science is emerging right now in the laboratories and offices around the world, where embodied, embedded thinking is under active investigation and development. That embodied, embedded is the always already in the world coupling kind of AI that he's talking about there. And now these two things come together in this interesting way. And after the failure of good old-fashioned AI, Minsky was no longer head at MIT. I was at Berkeley, and they called me back to give a talk to the AI people. And I gave them a talk, why AI researchers should study being and time. And that's where finally these two came together. And I said, quote, the meaningful objects among which we live are not a model of the world stored in the mind, but they're the world itself. In that very same year, Rodney Brooks moved from Stanford to MIT, became head of the MIT AI lab, and declared, quote, that the best model of the world is the world itself. And he says, in a quote that I haven't got here, people tell him that that's Heideggerian, but he figured it out for himself. And I'm not going to try to settle that. But what he says about the frame problem is interesting, and I want to read it. He says he makes robots, and they don't face the frame problem. Why not? Because they don't have representations of the world. They just have cameras that keep track of the world and microphones that keep track of the world. And he says, why could my simulated robot handle the frame problem? Because it was using the world as its own model. It never referred to an internal description of the world that would get out of date if anything in the real world moved. So you answer the frame problem by making something that keeps track of what's going on in the world. Now, has he done it? Has he made Heideggerian AI? No, because there's one basic thing missing. His robots only respond to fixed features of the world, like the pop bottles. One robot goes around the AI lab picking up pop bottle cans or pop cans or something, and it's certain features. He calls these robots animats because he understands that they're like insects. They don't learn. They don't have familiarity. They just respond. So he hasn't really solved he solved the frame problem, but he sort of changed the subject. What he hasn't got is the following fact or following phenomenon, that as we learn more and more about the world, it gets more and more familiar, and things look like, windows look like what they draw us when it's hot. A Merleau-Ponty example is useful. When we learn our way around in a city, it starts looking relatively meaningless. And as we get used to it, we actually see the relevance, familiarity, that at this corner is where you turn to go to the bakery, and that corner is where you catch the bus, and you don't even have to think it just looks bus catching and laundry-like, and that's what the animats don't have. So, in a way, they've made a big step. They've abandoned symbolic representations. They've abandoned cognitivism. But they've ended up in a kind of brute of empiricist behaviorism now, in which these animats are just responding to fixed features of the environment and aren't learning anything. So we have to stop with that. And the answer is that once you see the Heideggerian phenomenon, you see both the good old-fashioned AI couldn't work, and you see that the new kind of Rodney Brooks MIT AI for robots isn't going to capture our kind of intelligence and our kind of phenomenon either. And but I guess I should say Michael Wheeler has a whole lot to say about all the various versions of the coupling of brain and world, which he thinks of as Heideggerian AI, and thinks that they're finally on the right track. Somebody wants to say one thing. Well, no, I said that. I don't know I don't see any way to make a robot concerned about its own being, but then we're a material thing, and we're concerned about our own being, so it looks like at least you could make something that's concerned about its own being. Wait, I can't hear you. Please stop with that. We'll talk, he and I'll talk afterward. Okay, read space for next week. Now, come up, or I can't hear you.
Oh, perfect.